Hi, I'm Ali Heather. We're out in Glenmuick in the Cairngorms in the northeast of Scotland. I'm walking along an old drove road and I'm hiking an old drove inn. To learn more about the drovers and the roads, I've come to speak to countryside expert Fred Gordon. Hello Fred.
Hello.
How you getting on?
Oh, I'm getting on fine.
So tell us a bit about these drovers. What were they?
Well, the drovers were a bunch of people who were professionals, and their job was to collect cattle throughout the whole of Scotland, and they drove them south, and some of them came through here, and they were heading for Falkirk, where there was the Troist, as it was known, where they sold the cattle on to the English drovers. And then these cattle went into the Midlands of England, where the Industrial Revolution was going on, because there was a hungry market for all the beef they could get.
So these drovers, they wouldn't have given their lane with all these kye, would they?
Oh, no. Some of them went on horseback, some of them walked, and they also had dogs. Just the same as a shepherd these days might have a few dogs to keep his flock in check. These drovers had dogs to keep the cattle going in the direction they wanted. And these dogs, some of them had done this journey several times, so they knew exactly what they were about.
Aye. So they get down to Falkirk and sell all the kye off. What would the experience be like after that?
Well, the experience, like any bunch of lads who've been out in the heather for a few days, the first thing once they got pied was they were looking for a dram. So they would go into the pubs in Falkirk, and of course that's left the dogs for you going to deal with the dogs. Well, the dogs went home themselves, and I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the Hell-Droven story, was the fact that the dogs went home themselves.
So most of the time, these drovers would probably sleep out of doors. But a height them was their special inn along the route.
Well, a lot of them wrapped themselves in their plaids and just went into the heather, and there are descriptions in the history of this whole thing about them looking pretty gruesome with all their plaids and their woolen this, that, the next thing. But sometimes they did come up on an inn, and there's one behind us here, and they would go into the inn, and their first thing they did, of course, was have their dogs fed, because that was the most important thing to them. Feed the dogs, then themselves would go in and have a bowl of brose, and the cattle would be kept in a little field behind the inn called the Stance, and there's one here as well.
That's really interesting. Now, before we leave it, down at the market in Falkirk, they've taken maybe 100 kye down there with them and sent them off. They've got a big putchy cellar and they sent the dog off home. Was it not awfully dangerous to be stravaiging about with that kind of money?
Well, life was dangerous then, there's no doubt about that, and you're right, they were vulnerable. But so were the cattle, so they only had to protect the cellar on the way home, they also had to protect the cattle on the way down, because there were professional reavers who would come along and steal a few of your cattle and head off to feed their families, because a lot of folk were starving back then, and they made money by selling the kye back to the folk that had just sold them.
Interesting stuff.
So there was a lot going on, but it was a very important part of the economy.
And how would they protect themselves against these threats?
Well, they had all sorts of arms. They would have their broadsword, they would have the dirk, and they would also have the ski and do. Now, the ski and do, or dark knife, or hidden knife as it's sometimes called, was a wee short knife that they would keep on their person as a last resort. And quite often they kept it under their armpits, and that's how it got its name, the dark knife, because it was hidden. And I've actually got one here. This is one that a modern version of the same thing. But the handle is the interesting part, because it was usually carved out of juniper wood. Now, the juniper wood is a normal woody brown colour, but it's very fine grain because the juniper bush grows very slowly. So it was easy to carve nice intricate patterns on these, and these days they're painted black. But how did they get black? Well, if you put a knife of juniper under your oxter, what happens is the sweat in your oxter turns the juniper wood black. So a real old drover's dirk, or the drover's ski and do would have a black handle from the sweat from underneath his oxter.
So Fred and I have had to hunker down behind a great big stain in the landscape to get out the wind. And that gives you some idea, the roughness of the landscape, the coarseness of the weather. How would the kye got on crossing this place?
Well, first of all, the cattle were used to rough terrain in some respects, but they were travelling very slowly, because they had to keep the fat on them. They didn't want to do long journeys so that they lost all that beef, all that fat that they had. But when they came to really rough country, the drovers would actually put shoes on them, the same way as you shoe a horse. Now, if you think about a cow's foot, it's two halves. It's cloven hoof. And so each cow had 8 of these little plates on their feet.
So you mentioned earlier on, as we was bringing the calves and bringing the kye down, they'd have some unexpected visitors now and again with the whisky smugglers.
Oh, they travelled along with all sorts of people. I mean, you would have itinerant farm workers, but you would also have the whisky smugglers. Mm-hmm. Now, whisky was an important product in the hills around here at that time, and it was carried by the whisky smugglers in small barrels on each side of the wee sturdy Garran Highland ponies. And quite often these lads would walk along with the drovers, and no doubt from time to time they sampled the wares. The drovers also carried a ram's horn, which they filled with whisky, so they might have had a top up every now and again.
So Fred, our drovers, they'd be going all the way down to Falkirk or rough country. They wouldn't be passing many inns or cafes, so how would they be feeding themselves?
Well, the basic staple of their diet was oatmeal. And the original use of the sporran was to carry oatmeal. So inside your sporran you might have a big poke of oatmeal that you were using for a few days, and a wee cup, and you would mix up the oatmeal with hot water if you had it, or cold water. But sometimes if the going was quite tough, they weren't averse to slitting a vein in the cattle and letting that bleed into the oatmeal. They coloured the oatmeal black, but it gave them extra nourishment, and it's actually the origin of black pudding.
Well, the Mick Noah had a full Scottish breakfast, but with black pudding, whisky, ski and doos, it certainly was a full Scottish experience. Cheers very much, Fred.
My pleasure.